Today I'm talking about the myth of the plow. This comes from Before the Muses, an anthology of Akkadian literature edited by Benjamin R. Foster. So the myth of the plow is one of the Babylonian creation myths. I've talked in this channel a couple of times about the most famous Babylonian creation myth, Enuma Elish, but there were other Babylonian creation myths, and this is one of the other ones. I actually read this once before. So earlier this year I read Babylonian Creation Myths translated by W.G. Lambert, which included the Enuma Elish and then a number of shorter ones, and this was one of the shorter ones included in that edition, although they gave it a slightly different title, well, a completely different title. It was called the Theogony of Dunnu in Babylonian Creation Myths by W.G. Lambert. So yeah, as with a lot of these old Akkadian literature, there's no official name for it. It just comes to us on tablets without a title. So it's in this edition is called The Myth of the Plow for reasons that will become apparent very shortly. It starts off with a plow. But it's also known as the Theogony of Dunnum or Dunnu. And I'm sure there's some sort of linguistic reason for this I don't understand. But sometimes there's Dunnum with the M at the end, and sometimes there's Dunnu with a U at the end. It must have something to do with the Akkadian language. And sometimes it's called the Harab myth. So one of those. But yes, so I read this before when I was doing Babylonian creation myths, although I only vaguely remember it, to be honest, as with a lot of these fragmentary myths that you read, even though it was only a few months ago. But my approach to reviewing that book was a little bit different. This book, as I've mentioned a couple times before, it's got a lot in it, and a lot of shorter fragments, and my general philosophy is to try to determine if something is particularly noteworthy and do a separate review only if it's noteworthy, which I wasn't doing when I read the previous volume, Babylonian Creation Myths by W.G. Lambert. So this one, The Myth of the Plow, is very short. You can see it here, it's here and here, and that's it. So just barely over a page of text. But it appears to be much discussed among scholars. So there's a Wikipedia entry for this. There's also the Oldest Stories podcast, which I've been listening to and will review once I get done with it. Dedicates half of an episode to talking about this myth, and online you can find various articles about this myth. And part of the reason that I think has attracted some attention, even though it's so short, is that it appears to be a precursor or an earlier form of the famous Theogony or Theogony by Hesiod. So if you're familiar with Greek mythology, you're probably familiar with the succession myth. So the idea that Greek mythology started off with the earth and the sky god Uranus, and then Uranus was overthrown by his son Cronus, and then Cronus and the Titans ruled the universe, but then they were overthrown by Cronus' son, Zeus, and then Zeus and the Olympian gods were ruling the universe. And that's, I believe, most earliest and most famously recounted in Hesiod's Theogony. Although nowadays most people know this from just, any Greek mythology book that they happen to read. So it was at one time theorized that the succession myth, where the Titans were overthrown by the Olympian gods, represented the new gods replacing the older gods. So in other words, the theory was that at one time in Greek culture, the Titans were the gods that everyone worshipped. And then at a certain point, the Olympian gods got introduced and they replaced the Titans. And that cultural replacement was symbolized in the succession myth in Greek mythology, where the Olympian gods overthrew the Titans. But as I've read in a few places, I think most recently the Routledge Handbook of Greek Mythology by Robin Hard. I hope I'm remembering the author's name right. I'll link to it in the description down below either way. Anyways, as I read in a couple of places, that theory is now not in fashion for a couple of reasons. One reason is I believe we don't really have any evidence that that such a replacement ever took place in Greek culture. That one time the Titans were being worshipped and then later the Olympians replaced them. But then the other reason that that explanation is no longer in favor is because it looks like that story of the succession myth actually came from older stories in Mesopotamia. And there's a few different stories that have this pattern. And I think it's a little bit unclear which ones influenced which or what the exact pattern of influence is. But according to Wikipedia, at least, whoever wrote the Wikipedia entry credits this story, the myth of the plow or the Theogony of Dunnu, for being the original. I think I read somewhere on the internet that we only have this in an Assyrian copy, but it's presumed that it was a earlier Babylonian work, as most Assyrian literature, it seems to be copied from Babylon. But let me just go through it and recount the myth. And it's short enough that I could easily read it. But I'm afraid that would be violating Benjamin Foster's copyright on the translation here. So I'll just summarize it. It's, as I said before, it's a succession narrative where there's we start off with a god and a goddess, and then they get overthrown by their children, and then they get overthrown by their children, and then they get overthrown by their children. And that's pretty much all you need to know. Now I'm going to go through it and see if I can remember the order everything happens, and I'll look down here if I need to cheat. We start off with what is translated in this edition as the plow. So the plow married the earth in the beginning. There are a couple different translations available online which don't use the plow as the name here. They just give the proper name of the god. But I guess one translation of that is the plow. And then because he's the plow, he goes and he plows the earth. And then from the thrust of their plow, they create the sea. And I read somewhere online that presumably the plow plows out a hollow space in the earth, and then that space fills with water, and that's the sea. The plow also creates what is translated in this version as the beasts. And other editions that you can find online, it's translated as the cattle god, where again they just give the proper name of the god. So Earth fell in love with her son Beast and made an overture to him. Come, let me make love to you. So then Beast married his mother and killed his father. But then, so then Beast took over the lordship of the universe. But then Beast fell in love with his sister and married his sister, married his sister the sea. And they had a son who is called Phlox. So first we have the beasts, now we have the flocks. So the flocks, and then at around the same time this happened, the sea also killed her mother, the earth. So now the original generation has completely died off. So then the flocks marries his mother, the sea, and kills his father, the beasts. Now, at this point, we start having some gaps in the text. Can you see that here? There's some gaps here. There was some sort of son of flocks. Flocks in the sea had 4 children. There's some gaps missing. One of the sons of the flocks married River, and then he killed Flocks, his father, and Sea, his mother. And then he and the River had a son who was the shepherd, and the shepherd married his sister, the pasture. And then he killed off his father, whose name is still missing from the text, and River, his mother. And then the text gets a little bit fragmentary here. The Oldest Stories podcast, which I mentioned earlier, seems to have more information. I don't know. I've gotten different information about whether there are just one surviving tablet of this myth or different tablets. I do realize that watching this channel, I'm never quite sure of what's going on when I'm reading these Akkadian literature, so I'm stumbling my way through this. But I'm a little bit unsure what's going on exactly. So the Oldest Stories podcast does attempt to reconstruct the second half of the tablet, and he must have more available to him than is in this edition here. Some of the text on the internet, they don't really have much more information. But there are different reconstructions. Apparently, at one point, one theory is that eventually the killing phases out and we get to some sort of stability in terms of the rulers of the gods. And this leads, I believe, to some of the traditional Babylonian gods that we're familiar with. I want to say it's Ea and Anu, who are the regime we may finally settle on, according to theories about how to reconstruct the missing or fragmentary parts of the text. But you might just want to look this up yourself or do some of your own research. I'll link to a couple resources in the description down below. And that is it. That is all we've got here for the myth of the plow. So for whatever my summary may have been worth, or I would encourage you to check it out for yourself. It's possibly interesting for its influence on later Greek and Roman mythology. But there you go, the myth of the plow.